As years passed and massive cultural changes swept across the globe, the Berlin Wall remained a symbol of conflict and struggle. Eventually, tensions reached a breaking point. To understand why the wall fell, we need to look back to when it was built. Before the Berlin Wall's construction, nearly a fifth of East Germany's population had fled to the west. The war and the heavily guarded border throughout East Germany ensured most of the remaining population stayed within the country's boundaries. While these measures helped stabilize the economy, living conditions in East Berlin did not improve. Working hours were long, life was strictly monitored, and luxuries were few and far between. In the late 1970s, even coffee became scarce. After struggling with shortages, East Germany sought new suppliers in Vietnam. On the other hand, social structures such as childcare and schooling were free in the communist system. However, these institutions still worried East Berliners who disagreed with the government, since school was the first place children were directly exposed to communist ideology. West Berlin and West Germany were even eliminated from official maps, and resentment grew among almost every facet of the population, including border guards. Michael Morrow was one of over 1,000 guards who defected to the West, spending his days tossing notes tied to cigarette packs over the wall to other dissenting soldiers. While life in West Berlin wasn't perfect, citizens enjoyed much more freedom. The counterculture movement was thriving, artistic life was flourishing, and young West Berliners explored group living in communes. Experimental art pieces and stage productions abounded, and the music scene was vibrant. People were free to live as they chose. As the Berlin Wall evolved to become more impregnable, relations between the governments of East and West Germany actually eased slightly in the early 1970s. A transit agreement and the Basic Treaty allowed the two nations to establish formal diplomatic ties and expand Checkpoint Alpha on the inner German border to simplify approved travel. In September 1973, both countries were admitted to the United Nations. For years, life continued separately on each side of the wall. In 1987, as East and West Berlin held celebrations for the 750th anniversary of their city, U.S. President Ronald Reagan gave a speech at the Brandenburg Gate. In his address, Reagan called on Soviet leader Gorbachev to tear down this wall, declaring that it would dramatically advance the cause of freedom and peace. That same month, David Bowie played a concert near the wall in the west, with many East Berliners attending from the other side. Violent riots broke out after the show, laying the groundwork for more protests. Nearly 2 years after Reagan's speech, holes began tearing through the Iron Curtain as communism started to collapse in the wake of Gorbachev's reforms. Hungary turned off their electric border fence with Austria, and following Hungary's example, Czechoslovakia also opened its borders, prompting tens of thousands of East German refugees to head west. In the spring of 1989, local elections were held in East Germany, but all of the listed candidates were chosen by the Communist Party. In response, opposition groups held peaceful demonstrations and leaked evidence of election fraud to West German media sources. The Soviets arrested at least 100 of the protesters but still reported a celebratory mood across the country. A cycle of demonstrations began to grow in Leipzig, where two independent pastors had been holding weekly meetings every Monday for years. As summer turned to fall, the gatherings for prayer and discussion evolved into a national movement. On October 9, 1989, as many as 100,000 people took to the streets of Leipzig in peaceful protest. Despite warnings from the Stasi, undercover officers who joined the crowd to cause trouble were quickly surrounded by demonstrators chanting "No violence." Secretly recorded footage of the event was broadcast on West German television, and with each following Monday meeting, the size of the protests doubled. By the end of October, more than 300,000 people marched in Leipzig streets. The spark of revolution spread quickly, and even larger demonstrations took place in East Berlin, where more than 500,000 people protested the communist regime in early November. In the wake of these events, most members of the East German government resigned. On the evening of November 9, 1989, an East German official was given last-minute orders to announce new regulations making it easier for East Berliners to obtain travel permits. He had only been given a note to read out loud, and when asked a follow-up question about when the restrictions would be lifted, he improvised, stating, "As far as I know, it takes effect immediately, without delay." Hearing this broadcast, East Germans gathered at the wall. The guards, who had not been given any orders, made frantic calls to superiors who wouldn't take responsibility. Outnumbered, the soldiers had no way to hold back the huge crowds. At 10:45 that night, the gates were opened, and people crossed freely, climbing the wall and dancing in celebration. In the days that followed, citizens from both sides demolished large sections of the wall using hammers and chisels, with many saving parts as souvenirs. On the first day, around 800,000 East Germans entered the West, where they were welcomed with a gift of 100 marks each. The wall officially remained guarded for some time, but new crossings were regularly introduced, and guards became more tolerant. A domino effect spread through many other Soviet satellite countries. Austria lifted various restrictions. An anti-communist movement openly started in Bulgaria, and Romania's head of state was overthrown before Christmas. The Brandenburg Gate reopened, and visa-free travel became available to all Germans. On New Year's Eve, David Hasselhoff headlined the Freedom Tour live concert, with more than 500,000 Berliners attending his performance. Hasselhoff sang his hit song Looking for Freedom from a platform suspended on a 20-meter crane above the wall. Just over 6 months later, Germany was formally reunified, and the Soviet Union fell soon after. For nearly 3 decades, the Berlin Wall was a central icon of communist restriction, but when it fell, it transformed into a symbol of hope and freedom. Many nations immediately responded to the events with their own fights for independence, and parts of the wall still stand today as a reminder that we have the power to break down barriers.